One of the most anticipated moments in the show thus far is presented in the second episode of The Chosen Season 5, Last Supper, Part 1, which depicts Jesus cleansing the Jerusalem temple by driving out the money changers, vendors, and animals with a whip. Matthew 21, 12-16, Mark 11, 15-18, Luke 19:45-46, John 2:14-22. In addition, we see John befriending Malchus, the servant of Caiaphas. See John 18:15-16, Andrew and Philip's reunion with Leander and the Gentiles of the Decapolis from Season 3, see John 12:20-21. Additional scenes of Thomas Kafni and Naomi dealing with Ramah's death, Peter's embarrassing first attempt at preaching in Jerusalem, and a great deal more. The purpose of this video is to present a comprehensive overview of the events that take place in the second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, as well as a review and analysis of the episode's most important themes and messages. The second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, What Happened Furthermore, due to the fact that the various plots in season episode 2 are so intertwined with one another, it is difficult to differentiate between them. In spite of this, I will separate out the stories of Thomas, John, and Caiaphas. In addition to providing an outline of the plot of Jesus, the disciples, and the Gentile ones who converted to Christianity, the inaugural episode of The Chosen's 5th season once more, the introduction provides us with a portion of the upper room discourse and the Last Supper. Jesus makes a change to the instructions he gave to his disciples when he first sent them out, Matthew 10, Season 3, Episode 2, and he encourages them to now take money bags and other resources, including swords, Luke 22:35-36. He does this because he anticipates that resistance will increase, particularly when his disciples begin traveling through territory that is hostile to them. In response, Simon Z inquires as to if the 2 swords that they possess will be sufficient, Luke 22:38, and Jesus explains that he was not being literal, but rather speaking hyperbolically about the perils that they were about to experience. He emphasizes that the disciples must continue to rely on God to provide for their safety. After that, he goes on to explain that the world will hate them because it hates him, and that he has chosen them out of the world, John 15:18-19. Nathanael seeks to understand the reason why Jesus is required to depart and must instead send a helper to stay with them, for example, John 16:7. In accordance with Zechariah's prophecy, Zechariah 13:7, Jesus cautions that all of them will abandon the journey, but he also encourages them to gather in Galilee, Matthew 26:31-32. The revelation that Satan has requested to sift them all like wheat is revealed by Jesus when Peter asserts that he will not fall away even if the others do, Matthew 26:33. However, Jesus also reveals that Satan has prayed for Peter's faith to falter, so that he can strengthen the others when he has returned. Luke 22:31-32. In Luke 22:33-34, Jesus makes a prediction about Peter's 3 denials before the cock crows. This occurs when Peter doubles down. When Peter and the others insist that they will give their lives for Jesus, Jesus responds by saying, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." John 15:13. However, because he is the one who is about to do this, they are not the ones who are giving their lives. The second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen features Thomas and Kafni. After the opening titles, we are treated to a second cold open, which takes us back to the moments just prior to the events that took place in the 5th episode of the 1st season. At that time, Capne had dispatched Thomas and Ramah to Cana in order to supply wine to the wedding. A crimson necklace is presented to Ramah by her mother, Naomi, just prior to her departure. This is a manifestation of the pride that her parents have in her, and the fact that she is now taking over the family business. We get a glimpse of the noble side of Kafni, who is offering a cask of wine that is more expensive than what the family is able to purchase. He does this because he recalls how the father was a decent man while they were both serving in the military together. in spite of the fact that he cautions Thomas not to bring shame upon the company, it is clear that he takes great satisfaction in Thomas's ability to plan ahead and pay extremely close attention to the details. We discover that when Thomas was a young orphan, Kafni took him in as a worker and has been his mentor ever since. This information comes after Kafni and Naomi have blessed Thomas and Ramah and sent them on their way, in spite of the fact that he is the one who recognizes Thomas's potential. Naomi is the one who acknowledges Ramah's attractiveness, charisma, and intuitiveness. During the time that Thomas is searching for cucumbers in the market, Kafni makes an appearance and continues to observe how Thomas continues to be overly concerned with details and plan ahead, with the exception of Ramah's safety. He takes Thomas in his arms and warns him that the next dinner he has with Jesus will be the last supper he ever has. During the course of his rage, Kafni is forced to leave the market by the proprietor of the shop, as well as by his own supporters. Thomas, who has been re-traumatized, sits down and begins to cry. Then, all of a sudden, he has the impression that he is seeing Ramah in the market, but he quickly realizes that it is actually her mother, Naomi. In spite of the fact that Naomi wishes she could simply despise Thomas, she acknowledges that Ramah has made her own decisions. Despite this, she expresses her regret at having to bury her own daughter. According to Thomas, Ramah had a deep affection for the life that they shared together, particularly for Jesus. In spite of the fact that he first had resentment toward Jesus, he now understands that he was actually projecting his own feelings of guilt and shame onto him. Despite the fact that he is unable to comprehend what is taking place, he is aware that Ramah, with her intuitive abilities, would have urged him to believe anyway. In the second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, Jesus, the disciples, and the Gentile converts meet. Peter begins the episode by delivering a sermon to the community. Just as he had intended to do in the first episode, he relies on Andrew to remind him of the words as he struggles through the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18:23-35. And as a result, he experiences feelings of frustration and embarrassment once the passage is finally finished. On the other side, Andrew is quite proud of his brother and remains adamant that the audience was anxious to listen to what he had to say. Simon Z, who observed the mysterious stranger taking notes, raises the subject of whether or not they ought to be preaching openly when Rome might take notice of them. However, Andrew and Philip disregard his worries. After some time has passed, Andrew and Philip are brought back together with Leander, Dion, and Fatia, who are the Gentile converts of the Decapolis, Season 5, Episodes 7-8. They have traveled from the Decapolis on a pilgrimage to worship, despite the fact that they do not know much about the tale of Passover or how to give sacrifices. They are now friends on better terms. In order to purchase sacrifices, Andrew and Philip bring their own animals to the court of the Gentiles. This is because they have not brought their own animals with them, due to the fact that the Gentiles only possess Greek drachmas that bear images of pagan deities, which is a form of cash that cannot be used directly to purchase an animal for the purpose of sacrifice. They are required to get temple coins instead. On the other hand, Philip and Andrew want to make it clear that the exchange rate is both predatory and enormous. At the time when the Gentile converts are questioning whether or not the temple system is in accordance with the teachings of Jesus, Andrew contends that Jesus has not come to abolish the Mosaic law, Matthew 5:17-20. As soon as they reach the booth of a money changer, he immediately begins to upsell Leander, arguing that he will want a more significant donation in order to make amends for his transgressions. In spite of the fact that his original fee is not particularly exorbitant, he adds a substantial additional charge, which he claims is essential due to the taxes that were levied by the Romans and religious leaders, as well as his personal requirement for financial support. In the midst of their argument on the cost, Leander wonders about the theatricality, but he ultimately decides to pay in order to avoid holding up the queue. While the Gentile converts were making their way into the temple, They came across a notice written in Greek that warned them that any Gentiles who attempted to walk deeper into the temple courts would be subject to execution. This caused them to feel uneasy. Tamar and Fatia go to a Libyan guy to acquire birds because they are unable to offer a full sacrifice, like males can. As soon as he saw Tamar's emerald jewelry, he was reminded of his sister. He decided to give her some free doves, and also refused to accept cash for the pigeons that they had planned to buy. With a clear interest in Tamar, he extends his best wishes for a joyous Passover to her as they proceed. He then joins the queue to hand over their birds to a priest so that he might perform a sacrifice on their behalf. At the time that Jesus arrives in the court of the Gentiles, he is shocked by the widespread avarice and the disdain that is shown toward the house of his father. When a random merchant walks into him while she is bringing her merchandise through the temple as a shortcut, he is obliged to halt her and order her to go back. This causes his anger to swell even more. Jesus finally reaches his breaking point when the vendor who took advantage of Leander inquires about the method of payment he intends to use. Taking out his whip, he uses it to knock over the table where the money is being exchanged. And then he starts yelling at everyone to leave the house they are in because they are profaning his father's home. He begins releasing animals out, breaking tables, and knocking down other products that are being offered as the court erupts into turmoil. He insists that the merchants are thieves and are contributing to the crisis. People are able to observe the hubbub. A call is made by Shmuel for temple guards. Atticus makes an attempt to enter the building in order to observe. There is a sudden arrival of James and John. From their palace, Claudia and Pilate stare out at the world below. While Andrew is on the run, he comes into Peter and insists that Jesus has lost his mind. Taking a look at Shmuel, Caiaphas, and Zebedee from the opposite side of the court, Jesus accuses them of being a group of malevolent individuals. Judas looks on in disbelief as he approaches them with a wipe in his hand and exclaims, "What have you done?" Caiaphas in the second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. The preaching that Peter delivers at the beginning of the episode is listened to by one of Caiaphas's servant girls. This girl is most likely the one who will accuse Peter in John 18:16-17. She then reports back to Caiaphas, who dismisses her and prepares for his oil appointment with Zebedee. Caiaphas enjoys a meal with Herod later on, during which Herod rambles on and on about the poetry and food of the Greco-Roman past. Anxious, Caiaphas asserts that the Jewish people have just as fine poetry from David, Isaiah, and the other prophets. Despite Herod's dismissal of the biblical poetry as not being as fun, Caiaphas, who has spent enough time engaging in pleasantries, then inquires about Jesus. The first thing that Herod does is seem as if he is not aware of what is going on, but then he proposes that the religious leaders try to kill Lazarus rather than worry about Jesus. Herod is under the impression that Caiaphas is being compelled to pursue Jesus by Annas, Herod's father-in-law, despite the fact that Rome is the only nation authorized to carry out the practice of capital punishment, and Rome has no interest in punishing those who are believed to be false prophets. Herod's duplicity is brought to light by Caiaphas, who reprimands Herod for his desire to kill Jesus because of his wife and father-in-law, John the Baptist. Herod was the one who murdered John the Baptist for Herodias. The response that Herod gives is that he maintains that he holds a separate position as tetrarch. Herod brings to Caiaphas' attention the fact that Annas was deposed for doing precisely the same thing that Caiaphas is attempting to accomplish now. Refusing to be dissuaded, Caiaphas claims that he has a deep-seated conviction that God has communicated to him the necessity of sacrificing one individual in order to redeem the nation. Caiaphas is adamant that Jesus ought to be dealt with immediately, despite Herod's insistence that Lazarus is a more secure target. Due to the fact that he does not have a following, the two individuals come to the realization that they must separate Jesus from the masses. And the only way to accomplish this is by causing him to make a mistaken statement regarding the one thing the people despise more than they love Jesus, which is taxes. The decisive moment for Caiaphas occurs at the conclusion of the story when Jesus starts the process of purifying the temple. When Caiaphas was standing at the entrance to the next court of the temple, he looked down on Jesus and appeared to recognize the opportunity that was sitting in front of him. In the second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, John, during the delivery of the anointing oil to the residence of the high priest, John is present to accompany his father, Zebedee. The servant of the high priest, Malchus, is the one who welcomes them and expresses his delight at the arrival of a new vendor who comes with such a recommendation. However, in order to approach the area where the sacred oil is stored, they are required to demonstrate that they have not engaged in any kind of ritual impurity, even if they have cleaned themselves in accordance with the ritual. During the time that Zebedee is enumerating the possible causes of ritual contamination, including nocturnal discharge, Zebedee enters the room. However, John becomes aware that he is not permitted to participate and asserts that he has made touch with leprosy. In addition, Malchus is unable to enter due to the fact that he has leprosy, and the two of them sit outside, resenting the fact that the older men take pleasure in defining their status in ways that exclude younger men. What Malchus tells John is that Caiaphas is preoccupied with a rabbi and is attempting to discover ways to destroy his power or focus Rome's ire against him. Malchus offers this information to John because a trial cannot take place during the Passover festival. They are running out of time as the holiday of Passover draws further and further away. Once Zebedee has returned from bringing the oil, he looks at John with a disapproving expression, as if he has realized the true cause of John's uncleanliness. A review of the second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen, I was quite satisfied with the most of what I got in episode 2, as I mentioned in the video recording of my reaction to it. The cinematic experience is something that I will not repeat what I mentioned in my review of episode 1, but everything that I said about the cinematic experiences is applicable to episode 2 as well. To be more specific, the event that took place during the purification of the temple was tumultuous, emotional, and engrossing. It was everything that I had hoped it would be. In terms of performances, Jonathan Rumi once again provides a vibrant and nuanced performance that really helps to ground the episode. Richard Fancy, Caiaphas, and Paul Ben-Victor, Herod, both provide very subtle and naturalistic performances, which caused me to invest in their characters in a manner that I had not done so previously. In the role of John, George Xanthus demonstrates a tremendous deal of vulnerability, and Shahar Isaac provides some terrific comic relief as Peter. Joey Vahady does an excellent job of communicating the sadness that Thomas is experiencing. The performances of Decapolis Gentiles in Season 3 were not very impressive to me, but I was pleased to see that they had made significant progress and were no longer noticeable, in a negative sense. Opening with the Last Supper. Once more, I think it's a terrific idea to begin with the segments from the Last Supper. It was a very logical decision to incorporate themes of mounting opposition and concern for finances into the story. The cleansing of the temple. The sequence depicting the purification of the temple was not simply cinematic, but also thoughtfully structured from a narrative point of view. The way in which the narrative gave us vital background by presenting it from the point of view of the experience of the Gentile converts is something that I appreciate. In addition, I thought it was fascinating to observe the many responses from both the followers and the adversaries. The emotional weight and significance of the moment was significantly emphasized as a result of this. Both Herod and Caiaphas really didn't get much chance to shine in Season 4, so it was fun to watch the strained yet civil relationship between the two of them. This element of the antagonist intrigue was the highlight of the season. In comparison to what I had anticipated, both of the characters are significantly more intelligent, three-dimensional, and lifelike. Camaraderie. The second episode featured a number of brief moments of friendship that I found to be an enjoyable experience. It was incredibly heartwarming to see Andrew show such a great deal of pride in Peter, and to encourage him when Peter's first attempt at preaching was not particularly successful. Another heartwarming scene was when John and Malchus had an unsaid connection because they both struggled with leprosy. Humanizing Kafni, Although it would be simple for the program to turn Kafni as an unredeemable villain, I really appreciate how the flashback established the generosity and dignity that lie beneath his hard demeanor and the apparent agony that he is experiencing at the moment. World building. Once again, I adore the way that the episode is equipped with a sense of depth and realism, thanks to the minuscule references to the Greco-Roman era. It is true that I had a few minor complaints regarding the episode. However, it is important to stress that although the amount of space I spend on these topics may give the impression that they are substantial, in reality, they were very minor, but complicated disagreements over biblical and theological principle. 2 swords, the directions that Jesus gave to his disciples regarding the sale of their cloaks and the purchase of swords have been the subject of a great deal of written material. A wide variety of interpretations can be found, including the following. Literal, Jesus really wanted his disciples to purchase swords in order to protect themselves. Allegorical, the 2 swords represent the sword of the state and the sword of the church. Hyperbolic, Jesus is simply emphasizing how dangerous the situation is about to become. And ironic, Jesus is ironically inviting the disciples to purchase swords as the suffering servant needs to be counted among the transgressors. It appears that the show is taking the hyperbolic view, which I believe to be the second most plausible choice. But the idea that Jesus is being ironic is the one that I find more compelling. There is a significant allusion to the fact that the suffering servant will be counted among the transgressors that is not mentioned in this exchange. This reference is found in Luke 22:37 and Isaiah 53:12. As a means of bringing about the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, Jesus is implying that the disciples are going to become transgressors by getting themselves armed with a sword. The disciples are admonished for taking up the sword in the garden, which is exactly what happens in the passage that is found in Luke 22:51. In contrast, Christ also reprimands the multitude for coming out with swords, Luke 22:52, using the same line of reasoning this time. On this episode of the Naked Bible podcast, David Burnett presents a compelling argument in support of this viewpoint. Sacrifices. When Leander is purchasing his sacrifice, the vendor says that he should probably get a large animal to match to the significant sins that he has committed. In particular, he believes that Leander must make amends for thoughts that are contrary to morality. Several aspects of this line of reasoning seem to be flawed to me. In general, the purpose of animal sacrifices was not to deal with issues of moral impurity or guilt, particularly with regard to impure ideas that were held within. In the first place, the purpose of the sacrifice system was to deal with ritual impurity, which refers to accidental infractions of the ceremonial commandments. For example, Leviticus 4:2, 13, 22, 27, and 5:24, 17, 18, Numbers 15, 21-29, Hebrews 9:7. In addition, sacrifices were necessary for the commission of specific offenses against civil laws that did not result in the imposition of the death penalty, for example, Leviticus 5:1, 6:2-7. According to Hebrews 10:4, 11, the sacrifices that were offered in the Old Testament were not intended to address general moral failings, much less internal moral deficiencies. Christians have a tendency to believe that the sacrificial system of the Old Testament operated in the same manner as the one described in the New Testament. This is due to the fact that Jesus' sacrifice atones for our general moral inadequacies, and because Jesus was concerned with our inner moral shortcomings. The ceremonial system of the Old Testament could only cleanse the flesh from the uncleanness of the rituals. Jesus was the only one who offered a means to cleanse the conscience, Hebrews 9:8-14. In addition, it is important to note that the size of the animal that was sacrificed was typically more closely related to the status of the individual than it was to the magnitude of the sin that was being committed. In Leviticus 4:3-12 and 4:22-26, for example, priests and leaders were required to make offerings that were more substantial than those offered by common people, Leviticus 4:27-31, or by those who were impoverished, Leviticus 5:7-13. Despite the fact that it is probable that the original Levitical laws were being applied incorrectly during the time of Jesus, I believe that it is regrettable that Episode 2 may continue to promote these pervasive misconceptions among contemporary Christians. Although I enjoy the scenario that takes place between John and Malchus in nocturnal emission, I believe that it may be difficult to understand for certain viewers, since the underlying reason that the two are unclean is not because of leprosy, but rather because of nocturnal emission. It is evident that they are experiencing a sense of awkwardness. The unintended loss of life fluids, such as menstruation or nocturnal emission, was considered a sign of human mortality under the law of the Old Testament. This resulted in the individual being considered ritually unclean rather than sinful. It makes perfect sense that the two men would feel embarrassed about their predicament, and I admire the fact that they appear to be bonding at this very moment. However, I could imagine some viewers becoming confused and coming to the wrong conclusions about what is taking place or how it pertains to John's ritual against his moral purity. Having said that, I concur that I would not want the show to explain everything in detail. A little bit more explanation could have been helpful in this situation. Season 5, Episode 2 of The Chosen, Key Themes and Concepts, The Frailty of Humans. Once more, the opening sequence of The Last Supper provides us with a glimpse into some of the most important topics from the episode. Jesus is aware of the frailty of his students' humanity and foresees the manner in which they will all ultimately abandon him. Peter is so adamant about his refusal to acknowledge his own imperfection that he even makes a solemn vow on the grave of his mother that he plans to serve his Lord in prison or put to death. As a response, Jesus predicts that Peter will ultimately betray him 3 times in the near future. When the disciples continue to deny their fragility and insist that they mean to die for their friend, Jesus explains that this is precisely what he has come to do. This is a very sad explanation. When Peter made his first attempt to teach in front of an audience in Jerusalem, we once again see the vulnerability and weakness that his character possessed. In spite of the fact that he has good intentions, his memory and lips disappoint him on multiple occasions, and he is forced to rely on his brother, Andrew, to save him. Peter's inadequacies are painfully obvious because he does not have the miraculous assistance of the Helper, whom Jesus promised in the beginning of the scripture. The purpose of the flashback to Rama and the later interaction between Thomas, Kafni, and Naomi is to provoke us to contemplate death, which is the most extreme manifestation of human fragility. The fact that Kafni is hesitant to acknowledge the vulnerability of his daughter is the source of his angry animosity. It is ironic that in the flashback, he acknowledges the possible economic and spiritual vulnerability of his old friend, but at the same time, he generously gives him a present of good wine. The efforts of the Gentile converts to bring offerings to God in the Jerusalem temple are the focus of a significant portion of the episode. The purpose of the temple's system of ceremonial purity and animal sacrifices is to serve as a consistent reminder to worshippers of the spiritual and physical fragility that they represent. The narrative of John drives home this idea even more strongly because it indicates that a person has been polluted by human mortality and frailty touching dead bodies, touching lepers, menstruating, or experiencing nocturnal emission makes a person ritually impure. Death and leaking life fluids are evidence of how our bodies decay outside of Eden. Additionally, menstruation and nocturnal emission are also considered to be ritually impure. As a result of their common experience of fragility, John and Malchus form a kinship with one another. Nonetheless, they are resentful of the senior priest's use of their vulnerability to exclude them. Both oppression and money. In the second episode of the 5th season, money is the most prevalent theme. At the beginning of the Last Supper, Jesus encourages the disciples to bring money bags with them because they will no longer be able to rely on support from the Israelites who are hospitable. Luke 22:25 through 26. This is another way in which the issue of money and provision is introduced. During the flashback that involves Thomas, Ramah, and Capne, we are reminded of the fact that the wedding family had a restricted amount of money to spend on wine. We also see Kafni's kindness in offering a cask that is more expensive than what his old buddy could buy. According to Peter's retelling of the parable of the unforgiving servant, both of the slaves do not have the financial resources necessary to repay their debts. In spite of the fact that the master forgives his debt in a kind manner, the ungrateful servant makes an oppressive effort to collect what he is owed from his neighbor. Matthew 18:23-35. In order for Leander and his pals to be able to give sacrifices, they are need to pay for other animals. Regrettably, they are only able to use foreign currencies that are considered heathen, and they are compelled to pay exchange rates and costs that are exploitative. The seller that Leander works with asserts that the high costs are the result of excessive taxes imposed by Rome and the officials of the temple. He is adamant that he is simply taking a reduction that is appropriate in order to provide for his family. Tamar enjoys the generosity of her new friend from Libya, who provides her with birds to sacrifice at no cost. Malchus is pleased to have a new supplier, and John and Zebedee deliver the oil shipment that they have been working on. Herod and Caiaphas come up with a scheme to undermine Jesus by exploiting the one thing that people despise more than they love him, which is financial taxation. Capne attempts to confront Thomas while he is at the market. Because he is concerned that a brawl could potentially interrupt sales, a nearby merchant separates the two individuals. A saleswoman who was attempting to reduce the length of her journey around the temple accidentally runs with Jesus. The fact that the sounds of people bargaining over prices are so loud that it is impossible to hear people praying to the Father is something that causes Jesus to feel frustration. And of course, when Jesus cleanses the temple, he accuses the vendors and money changers of being thieves, removes their money tables, and releases loose the animals that they are selling. The actual themes that should be taken away from this are not anything novel or exciting, but they are accurate and applicable. Because we live in a hostile world, we cannot always count on other people to have our needs met. Nevertheless, even while we take steps to meet our own requirements, we must never stop looking to God as the ultimate supplier of our needs. It is true that money can be a gift, particularly when it is utilized generously to bless people who are in need. Nevertheless, it is also the source of a wide variety of temptation. Exorbitant sums of money are frequently extracted from the impoverished and social outsiders, such as Gentiles, by those who hold political or religious power and status. This is a common practice among those who have these positions. The pursuit of wealth can divert our attention away from or impede our ability to engage in appropriate acts of worship and prayer. For many people, their love of Jesus is not as strong as their love of money or their hatred of taxes. Many people who label themselves as followers of Jesus end up abandoning him when he challenges their idols. Constraints imposed by the previous system, episode 2, provides us with the most in-depth look into the temple and the ceremonial system that it employs that we had up until this point. In accordance with Philip's explanation, the system of sacrifices is intended to be a beautiful representation of the way in which God kindly welcomes human people who are not deserving of entering his presence. On the other hand, as Leander and Fatia have pointed out, there are components of the order of the Old Testament that are in direct opposition to the teachings that Jesus imparted. There are some of these concerns that are circumstantial. Both the predatory money changing and the expensive animal pricing, as well as the barring of women from the temple court, are not essential components of the sacrifice system as it is described in the Old Testament. These problems have emerged as a result of human ingenuity and corruption. However, the Old Testament system, Hebrews 7:28, is designed to accommodate the fact that weak and corrupt humans played a role in the organization and execution of the intricate temple complex. In addition to this, the previous approach has a number of additional intrinsic problems. It is necessary to tear down the dividing wall of hostility that separates Jews and Gentiles in order to create one new man in place of the two. Ephesians 2:14-16. More crucially, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. The old system is incapable of even addressing the more fundamental issue that those who come face, and it merely serves as a reminder of sins every year. Hebrews 10:3-4. In episode 2, we are being prepared to anticipate the greater reality that Jesus will bring about via his own sacrificial death on the cross. This is accomplished by revealing the faults that are associated with the traditional ceremonial system. What were your thoughts on the second episode of the 5th season of The Chosen? Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts, questions, and hypotheses in the comments section below. What transpired in the first and second episodes of the 3rd season of The Chosen? It is recommended that you consider episodes 1 and 2 of The Chosen Season 3 to be a single and cohesive unit. I can't believe that the experience of seeing them separately would be as fulfilling as viewing them together, despite the fact that each of them has their own unique storyline arcs. Consequently, rather of attempting to differentiate between the two occurrences in a discrete manner, I will discuss both of them simultaneously. Some of the episodes of The Chosen have been critiqued by me for attempting to achieve too much, and for having a fragmented atmosphere. The fact that they were able to cover a lot of ground while still retaining a feeling of unity, focus, and energy is one of the things that truly impressed me about the first 2 episodes of the 3rd season. Over the course of these 2 episodes, practically every single one of the core disciples, that is, the 12 plus the women, receives a valuable experience. We also get meaningful moments for the family members of many disciples, such as Eden, Zebedee, and Matthew's parents. These moments set the stage for a plot that involves Yousef, the Pharisee that Shmuel used to hang out with in Capernaum. Additionally, we get a decent amount of time with Gaius, Atticus, and Quintus, and we get time with John the Baptist while he is in jail, along with a new character named Joanna. There is a lot of it, yet everything fits together without any problems. First and foremost, the first and second episodes of The Chosen established a distinct path for the course that the 3rd season of the show will take, as well as the conflicts that will follow. Due to the fact that each episode's action was concentrated, it was possible for episodes 1 and 2 to cover a significant amount of ground without appearing to be disconnected from one another. We have a multitude of different character arcs, but they are all investigating the same basic premise. What does it look like to come home after joining Jesus in his first mission and witnessing his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount? This is the question that is explored in the first episode, which is quite appropriately titled Homecoming. Some of the homecoming arcs are brought to a close in episode 2, which also focuses on Jesus' commissioning of the 12 apostles and preparations to disseminate his teaching throughout Judea, while also caring for the throngs that are flocking to him. Matthew, in the first and second episodes of the 3rd season of The Chosen episode 1, begins with a pre-credit prologue that is given to Matthew. We are able to understand that he is not merely an outsider who is misunderstood, which was a criticism I had in the first season. As a matter of fact, he dispatched Roman soldiers to collect from his father, Alphaeus, who provided a response that essentially stated, "You are dead to me." Matthew perceives that the teaching of Jesus regarding the necessity of making apologies with those who are angry with you, Matthew 5:21-26, has left him feeling convicted. He does not have a place to stay when he returns to Capernaum, in contrast to the other disciples who would have done so. He makes his way to his parents' house in an attempt to apologize, but his elderly dog is the one who alerts them to his own presence. It came as a complete surprise to him when he was invited into their home and referred to as son. This storyline is brought to a conclusion in episode 2, where it is revealed that Alphaeus was there at the Sermon on the Mount and was likewise arrested and sentenced to death. Matthew acknowledges that he wanted a luxurious life and to be better than others, while Alphaeus admits that it was unacceptable of him to disown his son. Both of them confess their crimes. Matthew admits that he wanted to be better than others. Both of them offer forgiveness to one another, and Matthew, who has now made amends with his parents, is invited to stay at his family home on more than one occasion. As a base of operations for the disciples, they make the decision to use his old home as a location. When Matthew is nominated to be the treasurer of the disciples, he declines the candidacy because he is deeply troubled by his history of dealing with financial matters. Judas in the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen Judas is mesmerized by the teachings that Jesus imparts. Immediately, he informs his shady mentor from season 2 that he is withdrawing from the business in order to go to the farthest corners of the planet in order to convey the message that Jesus has to offer. His mentor makes a threat to sue either Judas or Jesus, which is most likely a prediction of the events that will ultimately result in Judas's death. At the same time, he makes notice of the fact that Jesus needs to start a collection and become a better businessman. Judas has a meeting with Jesus and makes a request to be accepted as a disciple. He mentions that he had received some rabbinical study before to the passing of his father, and that he is able to provide financial assistance to them. Jesus explains to Judas that his credentials are irrelevant. What is important is that he is prepared to become like Jesus and undertake difficult things, as well as worship God. The name Judas derives from the Hebrew phrase, praise Yah. It is with the intention of transferring his home to his sister Devorah that Judas makes his way back to. She cautions him that following a person who claims to be the Messiah could result in his death. But Judas responds by stating that if Jesus is the Messiah, then he will not be killed, another setup for Judas's fall. Judas has a strong desire for his life to be about something other than money, and he is confident that he can contribute to the financially stable and effective operation of Jesus' organization. After the apostles are officially commissioned in episode 2, this storyline is continued in the following episode. Judas makes an effort to present his suggestions for enhancing the financial situation, but Jesus stresses that in their first mission, they must all learn to rely on what God provides and learn to trust God for their financial needs. Judas, on the other hand, is the candidate whom Matthew proposes for the position of treasurer. Matthew, who has had a difficult history, does not trust himself with financial matters. Judas gladly accepts the offer. In the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen, Joanna, Andrew, and John the Baptist are seen. The 3 female disciples, Mary Magdalene, Rama, and Tamar, are approached by a wealthy Gentile named Joanna, Luke 8:3, that was inspired by the sermon and seeks to buy an audience with Jesus by offering a costly shawl from Nepal. Mary Magdalene, Rama, and Tamar are the 3 female disciples. After some time has passed, Joanna divulges the information that her husband is employed in the palace of Herod Antipas, and that she is carrying a message from John the Baptist. Given that Jesus is aware that this will provide Andrew with relief from the anguish he has been experiencing with John's captivity, he grants Andrew permission to go check on John personally. Taking Joanna with him, Andrew travels to John's cell. She claims that it will be detrimental to her reputation if anybody discovers that she has been paying John visits. And as a result, she threatens to make the jailer's life even more difficult if he discloses this information to anyone. Additionally, we find out that her husband is engaging in adultery. As soon as they locate John, he is overjoyed to learn of the teaching that Jesus delivered, and he encourages Andrew to concentrate on Jesus. Andrew acknowledges that the teachings of Jesus regarding anxiety and the necessity of concentrating first on the kingdom left him feeling convicted. In light of the prophecy made by Isaiah, which states that the Anointed One will bring release from captivity and an opening of the prisons, Isaiah 61:1-4, John is certain that Jesus will finally set him free. It appears that John is certain that Jesus will confront Herod, and he suggests that the most effective way for them to assist John is to listen to what Jesus has to say. Following his successful attempt to manage his anxieties, Andrew decides to pay Mary Magdalene a visit. After coming to the realization that he had never apologized to Mary for accusing and humiliating her in the 7th episode of the 2nd season, he felt compelled to make atonement for his actions. The 1st and 2nd episodes of the 3rd season of The Chosen feature Thomas and Rama. With each other, Thomas and Rama share a number of adorable moments. Everyone is aware of the fact that they are in love with one another. Zebedee becomes a friend of Thomas, and Thomas confides in Zebedee his intention to petition Kafni to grant him permission to marry Rama. While this is going on, Mary Magdalene and Tamar inquire of Rama whether or not she is interested in marrying Thomas. Rama makes an effort to conceal her joy when she learns that Thomas intends to approach her father for his consent. The conclusion of this storyline occurs in episode 2, when Jesus sends the disciples to different areas to carry out their ministry. Intentionally, he directs Thomas in the direction of Kafni. As soon as Thomas makes his plans known to Jesus, Jesus confirms his desire and explains that once he has completed the first part of his mission, which is to convert Joppa, he will then be able to go to Capne, evangelize Kafni, and ask Rama for her hand in marriage. Rama and Thomas have a conversation about it, and Rama makes the decision that she will go to Kafni before Thomas does so, that she can begin working on her father in order to ensure that he will have a positive reaction to Thomas. The first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen feature Simon Peter and Eden. Since Emma has moved in with her brothers, Simon is looking forward to having marital intercourse with Eden when he returns home. This is especially true given that Emma has moved out. Just as they were about to take any action, Nathanael showed up at their house and informed them that he was in need of a place to stay. Eden warmly welcomes Simon inside, despite the fact that he is obviously irritated. At the same time, Simon the Zealot appears. Over the course of the story, Simon and Eden are ultimately given the opportunity to study alone, although there is no explicit content depicted on film. During the time when Simon was absent, they reflect on how difficult it was for Eden. Eden is overjoyed when Simon tells her that he is hoping that they would eventually be granted a brief break so that they can begin the process of trying to have a child. The second episode continues along this same storyline. Eden suffers a great deal of devastation as Jesus dispatches the apostles. Mary Magdalene, Tamar, and Ramah appeared in the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen. In the aftermath of the Sermon on the Mount, the three women make their way back to Mary's minuscule dwelling, which is utterly devoid of any supplies. Furthermore, they have only a small amount of money and food among themselves. Tamar is interested in selling the expensive shawl that Joanna gave them, but Rama is not interested in doing so. Rama is upset by the way wealthy people try to buy attention, something she learned during her time spent serving wine. After a brief period of idle chatter, the women discuss the means by which they will be able to provide for themselves, possibly by selling anointing oil that Zebedee has produced. Due to the personal significance of her jewelry, Tamar is not willing to sell it under any circumstance. In the process of sending out the apostles, Jesus gives them the responsibility of not only finding ways to finance the mission, but also of providing care for the pilgrims who are making their way to Capernaum in order to meet him. Both the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen feature Big James, John, and Zebedee. Big James can't wait to get home and enjoy the delicious meals that their mother has prepared for them. He is a little irritated by the fact that John and Zebedee have become friends with Thomas and have neglected to keep him informed about a number of matters. In addition to expressing his immense pride in his sons, Zebedee also shares with them that he is beginning to produce a unique olive oil. In the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen, we see Nathanael and Simon the Zealot. Nathanael and Simon the Zealot make the discovery in episode 2 that there is a shanty town full of pilgrims who have come to pay their respects to Jesus. Because of this, they are concerned that Rome would take a negative stance on the matter. As a result of Simon the Zealot's failure to carry out the plan to execute the Roman official in the fourth episode of the second season, an assassin belonging to the Zealot faction has also arrived and has begun following him. When Simon later realizes that the assassin is following him, he is forced to climb up a structure in order to avoid being caught by him. To his astonishment, Atticus confronts him, who is aware that the Zealots are sending people to assassinate him. He is surprised by this revelation. When Simon sees Atticus again, he understands that he is the same person he was before. Atticus adds that he is all right with letting Simon walk free now that he has made the decision to give up his dagger, but that the Zealots will not be so merciful and will continue to try to track Simon down. Atticus also threatens that he will have to deal with the Zealots himself if they congregate in Capernaum with the intention of causing trouble. During the time that Jesus is pairing the two of them together for mission, Simon also learns for the first time that Matthew was a tax collector. Jesus makes the observation that Matthew is no longer a tax collector, in the same way that Simon is a zealot any longer. Episode 1 and Episode 2 of the third season of The Chosen include Jesus and the 12. In the first episode, we get to watch a substantial portion of the Sermon on the Mount, as well as the responses of each disciple to the sections of the sermon that resonated with them. During the latter portion of the second episode, Jesus calls the 12 individuals who he has chosen to be his apostles and delivers the sermon that is found in Matthew 10. He goes on to explain that they will go out and extend his ministry over the entirety of Judea by curing the sick and driving out demons. But at this time, they will only be able to do so with Jews. The disciples are a little dumbfounded by the fact that Jesus can simply bestow this power upon them, particularly considering the fact that many of them have gotten very little instruction up to this point. It is also explained by Jesus that they are to take very little with them so that they might instead rely on God and on the assistance of other people. Despite the fact that he advises them not to be afraid of those who kill the body, which makes them even more terrified, he explains that they will eventually follow him into death, but not quite yet, in order to ensure that people are prepared to accept his authority and his teaching when he arrives. They are making preparations for the forthcoming event. Simon and Judas, Andrew and Philip, Nathanael and Thaddeus, John and Thomas, Big James and Little James, and Matthew and Simon the Zealot are the pairs that Jesus chooses to divide them into. At a later period, the disciples join back at Matthew's old house to have their final meal together, but this time without Jesus. Psalm 3 is the one that Simon leads them in praying after he has given them all a pep talk. There is only one scene involving little James in episode 2, but it is a dramatic one. In his explanation to Jesus, he explains that he does not understand how he is being granted the power to heal others when he himself is still not healed of his own infirmity. Jesus adds that he is able to heal James at this very moment. Nevertheless, it will be an even more powerful and remarkable testimony to people if they see James praising God despite the fact that he is still suffering from his illness. James confides in Jesus that he is experiencing feelings of being a burden and that he is the weakest among the children of God. Jesus gives him encouragement, telling him that his bodily ailments are a lot less of a burden than the spiritual ailments of other people, and that God is not impressed by what men care about. During times of weakness, James is able to uncover his inner strength. Despite the fact that it may not be until forever, Jesus gives James the assurance that he will be healed. Both the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen include Pharisees and Romans. Episode 1 and Episode 2 of the third season of The Chosen feature Yousef. It is important to remember that during the second season, we discovered that Yousef, despite being a Pharisee, is truly a Christ follower. It is evident that Yousef is struck by the Sermon on the Mount, as are the common people whom he overhears comparing the personal authority of Jesus to the authority that is derived from the Pharisees. In the process of writing about it, he goes back to his synagogue, where he meets Jairus, Mark 5:21-43, who has recently taken over as the new chief administrator. Given the confusion that the Jesus movement has caused, Jairus seems to be implying that he has arrived to bring order to the situation. Yousef should take anything he writes about Jesus' teaching and put it in his vault for a few days or weeks so that his mind can settle. This is essentially the don't send an emotional email response until you've let it sit for a day guideline. He proposes that Yousef should do this. Yousef is grateful for this piece of wisdom. In a letter sent to Nicodemus, he completes the writing of what he had heard from Jesus, and then leaves it with Jairus with him. In the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen, Gaius, Atticus, and Quintus are seen. The two of them play the role of a buddy cop. They have a brief moment together in episode 1 following the Sermon on the Mount, during which they are both attempting to comprehend what they have just heard, particularly the message on enemies and retaliation, and they do not talk much. In the second episode, they become aware of the shanty village of pilgrims who are paying a visit to Jesus and are concerned about Quintus's attitude to the situation. In addition, Atticus gives signals that he is aware that Gaius is grappling with a problem in his personal life that he is concealing from others. It is because of the presence of sewage in the water that Quintus is in a foul temper when they go to report them. They inform Quintus about the camps, and he expresses his annoyance at the additional disruption to Roman order that this causes. First and foremost, he is upset because they have not informed him about the speech that Jesus delivered earlier. Both of them are dishonest, stating that the speech was only about Jewish traditions in order to minimize the impact of what was spoken. A proposed solution to the problem of the shantytown is presented to Quintus by Atticus. He suggests that Quintus extend the city bounds to include the shantytown and impose taxes on the pilgrims. On the other hand, Atticus cautions Quintus that he must use circumspection because the empire is looking for order rather than bloodshed. An ominous statement is made by Atticus to Quintus, stating that he would soon be returning to Jerusalem in order to meet with Pilate. In the previous sentence, it was mentioned that Atticus gives Simon the Zealot a warning about his pursuers. This action gives the impression that Atticus has some sympathy for the Jesus movement. During the course of their patrol across the camp, we also observe Gaius preventing another Roman soldier from engaging in violent behavior. He reminds the soldier to use a gentle touch when upholding the law. When Gaius encounters Matthew outside of his house, just before to the disciples gathering together, he makes a commitment to look out for the disciples' well-being and ensure their safety. The fact that he encourages Matthew to utilize his wits while he is out on mission is a strong indication that he has developed a more favorable perspective on the Jesus movement. Important ideas explored in the first and second episodes of the third season of The Chosen. Just a few of the most important ideas that are woven throughout these narratives are as follows. Belief and action are brought about by the word of Jesus. I was taken aback by the amount of the Sermon on the Mount that they incorporated all at once, but what they did was effective. The scene wasn't primarily about listening to Jesus deliver a sermon. Rather, it was about watching the disciples and other people listen to Jesus deliver a sermon. The actors did an excellent job of demonstrating how they were mentally processing what they had heard and how they were feeling conviction through the use of nonverbal communication. The majority of the action in episode 1 is then driven by the need to respond to the conviction that was brought about by the words of Jesus. In particular, his words about the need to reconcile, Matthew with his parents, Andrew with Mary, and the need to not worry, Andrew's worry about John, the women's worry about money, Eden's worry about Simon, and the need to not focus on money, Judas, Matthew, Tamar, are the most important. The program did a fantastic job of conveying the experience of conviction in a way that seemed genuine and was not cheesy, which is how it typically seems in the majority of Christian films. When the show was in its first season, I made the accusation that it placed an excessive amount of emphasis on the Jesus loves outsiders dynamic, to the detriment of Jesus dealing with sin. This episode more than made up for the previous one. In retrospect, there is a logic to it. When God first pursues us, his primary focus is typically on demonstrating his love for us and inviting us to enter his presence. However, as we grow closer to Jesus, he will eventually begin to shed more light on the aspects of our life that require modification. In addition, I adored the comment that John the Baptist made about how whenever Jesus talks, there is typically something in it for each and every one of us. This is such an accurate description of how sermons function. Jesus is the one who brings redemption. They were all incredibly well done. But the sequences of reconciliation between Matthew and his family, between Andrew and Mary, and between Matthew and Gaius were particularly impressive. In addition to being emotionally charged, they also have a realistic clumsiness and a certain degree of complexity, which I believe was the aspect that I loved the most. Jesus has a unique plan for each and every one of us. Despite the challenges they have encountered in their lives, and frequently as a result of those challenges, Judas, Matthew, and little James all come to the awareness that they have been molded in distinctive ways to carry out the purpose that Jesus has given them. Although Jesus does not require us, he desires to make use of us. This realization is brought to light when Jesus commissions the apostles and gives them authority and power over healing and demons, despite the fact that they believe they are not capable of doing them justice. In addition, I believe that the contrast between Judas and Matthew brings this concept to the forefront in an innovative and intriguing manner. The fact that Judas's first action is to hand over to Jesus a list of all he has to offer, as well as the fact that he seems a little too enthusiastic to be nominated treasurer, is a warning flag. Judas is incapable of detecting the temptation that money presents. Matthew, on the other hand, certainly would not have imagined of asking to follow Jesus. And when he is nominated for treasurer, he declines the nomination, despite the fact that he is capable of doing so. Matthew is aware that avoiding temptation is more essential than displaying his skills. It is possible that Judas's idea that Jesus requires him may cause him to follow his own plans rather than following the plan that Jesus came up with, that is, trusting God. Jesus' plan is paradoxical, and it is difficult to put one's faith in it. The paradoxical nature of Jesus' will and mission is something that a number of individuals grapple with throughout the story,